In this episode of Talking Clock, we sit down with Matt, who has created a high-end independent watch brand called Atelier Holgur. He discusses how he created the brand and its first watch, the Fromand, as well as the key challenges involved. There's also another video up where I review his watch, so check that out too. Also, please forgive my slightly poor audio. Enjoy. I guess as a starter, can you just talk us through how you got started with watches, as well as how that links to the brand that you eventually created?
Yeah, sure. First of all, thanks for having me. It's good to see you again.
Pleasure.
The watch collecting journey for me started quite young. I always had kind of like an obsession for interesting brands. Even back then, early 2000s, things like Ep.9 were already catching my eye.
Wow.
Obviously, couldn't really afford that at the time. But during those high school days, couldn't really afford anything that exciting. So, 18th birthday, as many young guys do get a watch from their father. I got one on my birthday, which was a Tag Heuer. And then I kind of chilled out until I got my first job. And that's when the sickness really started. I started collecting a lot of watches at that point. Nothing too fancy. Started off with a lot of Seikos and interesting, Japanese watches that I found. And then, of course, as I kind of climbed the ladder, I started getting more expensive watches. So that was kind of the start of my collecting journey.
Interesting. And would you say that the majority of the journey so far has been focused around sports watches, or do you dabble with dress watches, other things?
Yeah, I think at the start it was fairly sports watch driven, but I still had a fair amount of dress watches as well. Seiko, they have really interesting dials, so
yep.
I had a few of those kind of like fun starry night kind of dials, or that were a little bit more dress focused, but my lifestyle and I like to go diving as well, so I kind of stuck with more sporty watches. Yeah.
Then I think you're actually one of those people who will bring a watch diving, even though I suppose with modern technology, is it actually a necessity nowadays?
Yeah, I'm absolutely one of those guys that takes a watch diving.
Now
always on my wrist.
We'll put in some photos here. But
yeah, absolutely. Always on my wrist, I have something that I want to dive with. As a necessity, not really. You can use computers, to log your dive and make sure you're not going into decompression and all of that stuff. Won't go into that too much. But what I like to use watches for when I'm diving is just to keep track of time. Also to time certain things that I'm doing. So if I'm doing like a safety sub, something like that, I'll just adjust the bezel and time that with my watch rather than fiddle around with the computer too much. So I still use it for a practical application, although the importance of it during a dive has kind of dropped down. So always diving with one watch.
No, awesome. I think you showed me a photo of you taking an AP actually diving, and that was very disconcerting. But
not my watch, but a friend who said, "This is a dive watch. You have to take it diving." I was like, "Are you sure?"
Okay. Well, it's on him if anything goes wrong, I suppose. But from there, correct me if I'm wrong, but I guess diving and creating a dive watch was what eventually led to you creating your own brand?
That's right. There is another part of the launch of the company, but from purely my perspective, I had always wanted to make my own watch, and it was a dive watch. And for me, I was always toying around with, if I could make a dive watch, what would it be? I had several tool-focused diving watches that were very industrial looking. I had a Rolex Submariner, which was fairly elegant but still very tool focused. So I was always scratching my head with what would I do, which created basically this was the result of those ideas. But that whole process didn't really start until my good friend Asbjorn, who was my high school friend, reached out to me asking, "Hey, do you know anything about watches? I've been thinking of making one." And this was kind of like the the stars aligned moment, because I was also toying around with the idea at the time, and then we went on this journey together, and we started this journey together. So that was kind of one avenue. One was purely just my own curiosity in terms of a watch collector and as a diver, like what would I make, and then Asbjørn coming and saying like, hey, let's do something. And then us taking that journey together.
Awesome. Then, out of curiosity, when did this project start exactly? Or when you guys were sort of toying around with the idea?
Yeah, so it would be about just over 2 years and 3 months or so.
Okay.
That's when that conversation really started.
Wow, that's not an easy time to start, right? Because COVID, or
no, yeah, it was a Zoom a Zoom business.
Oh wow!
Everything was done on WhatsApp, on Zoom calls, because we were right in the middle of the pandemic. He had just had a daughter, so he was at home. So that was what we were spending our time doing outside of work.
Awesome. Then, so could you briefly go through, because I think I, like many people, obviously would not have any experience sort of when it comes to, creating a watch band or the steps that you have to go through. And I think it's even more unique for your case, since I'm sure at the time, a lot of the exploration was probably quite limited, since travel was probably not really a thing. So in terms of like the various steps that you went through, could you sort of like break that down, or like the key sort of steps that went to creating the brand?
Sure. It first started off with what would we make. So I went down the path of kind of sketching out my watch and my concept. He also did his own concept as well. So we wanted to actually make 2 watches at the beginning.
Oh, wow.
We quickly realized that maybe we should focus on one.
Were they both dive watches, I guess?
They weren't dive watches. Mine was a dive watch, and his was more of kind of like a field style watch.
Okay.
So one day we will make that. So we started off with concepts and designing the concepts, and when we had rough ideas that were interesting enough to us, we started to reach out to manufacturers in Switzerland to see like, hey, can you guys actually help us make this, because we're not trained watchmakers, we can't make this from scratch. So we started with pulling together a few different partners. We spoke to a consultant who didn't charge us. It was just more of a happy chat, and he just gave us some advice and some people to reach out to and say, oh, you should check out these guys and speak to this person. So we started pulling together a few different manufacturers and designers and people that would help us make this come to life. And when we had kind of a rough roadmap of manufacturers that we could work with of different, I guess, qualities and levels of expertise, someone who could help us with the technical designs of the watch as well, because 300 meters of water resistance is not going to come just from a few sketches of my design. Then we started to put together the business plan. So how much was this going to cost us? How long would it take? Did we need investment? At the time, we were like, no, we don't. We can bootstrap this. We essentially pulled that business plan together just to get some eyeballs on it. Some people who had worked with small companies before, or companies that were starting up, and just to give us advice and at least give us some direction to go from, here's a cool product that we want to make, here's some marketing ideas, and here's the rough costs. What else do we need? And from there, it really, I guess, escalated, because at the time we felt it was going to be just the 2 of us bootstrapping it. And, if it didn't work out, we would have some nice watches for ourselves. Yeah.
But actually, I'm not sure what the timeline is for other brands, but for those that are unaware, at time of filming, you have just delivered the first sort of customer pieces of the watch.
That's right.
And it's been around 2 years since you guys even floated the idea.
Yeah, that's right.
But so within that process, in terms of designing and that sort of thing, was it a very time consuming part, or what would you say is the most time consuming out of everything?
Good question. The most time consuming, I would say, apart from, of course, waiting for the production, right?
Right.
It was definitely the prototyping process. So, we had to, of course, get the technicals designs done. We had it 3D printed. I think you've seen the 3D printed case when I bring that to you. Just to see, the rough sizing. And then we started to get the product, or at least a prototype. So as I'm wearing one right now, we had a few different phases through the prototyping time. The first phase, there was no polishing on the case at all. The strap was quite different. The movement, we had it skeletonized. It also took some time in terms of, getting the sketches right. So the dials, we had a few different, I wouldn't say issues, but, things that we had to kind of tackle. So strap and dial and case, almost the whole watch, right? Were parts that we spent a significant amount of time tweaking to make it into what it is today.
Awesome. Then, like you said, today you're wearing the prototype on your wrist. Can you just quickly go through, what exactly you've created, as well as, since you were the one who designed it in the first place, what are the key elements that you wanted to go into the watch?
Sure. I'll start off with kind of the concept of the watch before I kind of talking about any specifications. In my eyes, these days, tool watches don't need to be so tooly, so to speak. A lot of those kind of dive watches are really kind of like hardcore and like, really big and you can beat it up and, very macho. But from my perspective, manufacturing tolerances and all of this, you can build any kind of watch now and make it, water resistant to significant depths. So, I wanted to combine a watch that had, the tool hardiness of, the traditional quote unquote dive watch, but blend that with aspects of watchmaking that I found really attractive as a watch nerd, right? Micro rotors and skeletonization and hand polished beveled edges and all of these things that you wouldn't really find in a dive watch, which I found to be a shame because I love dive watches. I dive with dive watches. I usually wear dive watches, but most of the time there isn't anything that gave me the satisfaction of a really interesting watch for a watch nerd. So that was kind of the concept of the watch. In terms of design concept, it was about contrast. So throughout the watch, you will see sandblasting, so kind of more almost dull finishing with high mirror polishing. So this white and this black, there's sandblasting and this polishing, and that is consistent throughout the whole watch. So same with the movement, it's sandblasted and then has all those polished edges. The case, as you can see, is sandblasted and has all the polishing. The dial has, soft, shiny areas, and then it has, the snailing that gives it that kind of texture and graining, and of course the black and white is there as well. So those were, I guess, some of the design elements that we wanted to pull into here. And then in terms of specifications, it's grade 5 titanium, not because it's trendy, but because it is a good material to use as a dive watch. It's rust proof, it's really strong, it's very light, so as a tool watch material, 2 thumbs up. It has fixed lugs, which is great from a diving perspective because you don't have to worry about losing it. But the problem with fixed lugs is that you have to put on a NATO strap or a single loop, which would block the movement. And what we did to kind of address that issue, because to me it is an issue, and of course because it blocks the movement, we created a strap that allowed you to have a look at the movement, but still have fixed lugs. So a very interesting, well, at least to me, interesting system that allows you to quickly put on this strap, enjoy the back of the watch. And then when you go diving, you can put it on a single loop that we, of course, provide with the watch, so that you won't have to worry about losing it. That's roughly the technical specifications of the watch. Aside from the movement, we partnered with Schwarz Etienne with their ASC 200, which is kind of their base movement, so to speak, and we've had it, skeletonized, polished, and sandblasted to give us this fun result.
Awesome. I think before I dive into sort of like the key challenges or the hard about like creating a piece like this, I just wanted to quickly ask, in terms of sizing, how did you even arrive at that? Because I feel like, especially in terms of like the community nowadays, it's quite the contentious issue. I mean, largely because people have different wrist size. So how did you arrive at like the final figure?
We went with 40 millimeters, so as you know, and 48 lug to lug. So I was quite picky with the dimensions of the watch because I wanted wearability above all. Just having a really, really big watch sure gives it more like, oh, this is hardcore and heavy and tooly. But I felt that the wearability was more important. Not that this is like a flimsy watch. It's full titanium and you can take a beating. But that wearability, I felt 40 millimeters was a good kind of catch-all size. It could fit most wrists. I have very big wrists, but Asbjørn doesn't have as big wrists as I do. But the watch looks good on both of our wrists. It was about having something that you could wear on a day-to-day basis and really enjoy, and not have this huge hunk of metal on your arm that was kind of like weighing you down.
Yeah, personally, I think 40 is a very nice size because there are watches, or plenty of the popular sports watches nowadays are 41. And personally, for me, like the VC Overseas or a 41mm Royal Oak tend to be just too big. And 40 is like a kind of nice sweet spot. So going off that, then, could you just talk about the main sort of challenges or the most difficult parts in creating this piece?
Sure. I've already mentioned it. There was the strap and the case and the dial. So the case, initially it was fully sandblasted. Wanted to give that more kind of party look, a rugged look. But when I got the case in hand, I was like, it's missing something. It doesn't feel alive to me. So we decided to get the edges of the lugs here polished, the outside of the crown guard polished, and the entire back, of course, aside from the case back bit. And the result is great, but it was very difficult to get this actually done. I'm joking with the guys who are making the case, because they suggested like, hey, why don't we do some polishing? And I was like, that's a great idea. And then they really shot themselves in the foot with this one, because it's extremely challenging to do this.
It's hand finished, right?
The case manufacturer they didn't want to do it.
Right.
So we had to actually get the watch sent back to Switzerland to be hand finished, and then go back to the manufacturer to have the case basically assembled, the bezel. So that was the first challenge. Not so much my challenge, but my personal challenge, but it was more of a challenge for the manufacturer.
And also, if I'm not mistaken, titanium is also harder to work with, right? Compared to like steel, for example.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
It's a difficult metal because you can only polish a certain grade. So the grade 5 titanium is the only grade of titanium that you can polish. And titanium can catch fire when you're polishing it. So having significant amounts of your case polished, I guess, is the challenge here. And to get it polished looking good, right? It can't just be like a little bit shiny. It needs to be a mirror reflection. So that is a challenging thing. So you have to polish it very carefully. You can't go too crazy on it. So it is a labor of love, so to speak.
Okay.
Yeah.
Then I guess the strap, basically, you had to create something that fit the fixed lugs, but the final one would be the dial, I suppose.
Yeah. The strap was more of testing out different solutions. So that was a simple in the sense that we just went with the safest option, so that the watch would never fall off the strap. So that was easy, but it took a few rounds to kind of say, okay, this is the design that we're going to go with. The dial, we went with a black dial, and I said, I wanted sunburst because I want to give some life to the dial. However, when we got the first prototype dials, the sunburst effect really wasn't there. Very, very light. If you catch it in very strong light, you could see a little bit. And I said, hey guys, this is not really working for me. It looks quite flat. And we then started to try and find ways to give it this ability to give you sunburst, but still have a black dial. Because when you're diving, black and white is it's the most legible. So this is why we went with a black dial. So the only real way to get the sunburst effect on the dial was to tone down the pigmentation of the black to allow the sunburst to come through. But then you'd have more of a gray dial than a black dial. So I didn't want to make that compromise. So what we ended up doing was having the dial engraved in the snailing fashion, because it was already on the sub-seconds, but we now then extended it over the whole dial, which, when you look at it just like that, is a black dial, but when you catch it in the light, you really have a very strong sunburst effect, but a different style of sunburst versus the one that you usually kind of like outward lines. This is more concentric circles, kind of creating this kind of fan effect. So we felt that was a great solution because it gave some texture to the dial. It allowed us to keep like a very deep black on it. And then, of course, it had some good sunburst effect on it, which was different from the usual sunburst that we're used to. So it worked out in the end for us.
No, I think the end result is stunning. And I was saying off camera that I had seen some close-up shots. And yeah, the attention to detail is also great. I think, that's probably all to cover the watch that you've created. But to end this sort of first segment of the podcast, I just want to ask you a quick sort of fun question. As someone who has been looking at watches and is sort of ahead of the curve in the sense that you caught on to independence and that sort of stuff pretty early on. Let's say that today I gave you infinite budget to create a 3-watch collection. You cannot sell any of the watches, and you cannot create any crazy piece unique that doesn't already exist. So off the top of your head, not perfect, let's go.
What would I do? Oh, great question. I would have to go back to one of the first independents that I really fell in love with, Urwerk. These guys have been doing crazy stuff for many years, and very early on in my watch collecting journey, it really caught my eye, and I was very attracted to what they're doing. Their latest Spock watch looks incredible. I've seen it in person, and met Felix.
Oh, nice.
It was kind of like an event, so I will get one of those. That's an awesome piece. Next, what would I do on the next thing? Maybe MB&F. MB&F also making very interesting stuff, and from an independence way, I think they're like really waving the flag for the whole scene, and really making that I guess really stand out and well known. And then finally, I don't know which model though. There's so many nice ones. And then finally, what would I go with? I would want something more dressy, a bit more complications driven. Patek Grand Complications, something I loved for many, many years. But there's so many other brands that I'd also love to do. But that was one of my early first loves, the Grand Complication for Patek Philippe. Super beautiful.
Any particular in mind?
The 5270p with the salmon down.
Nice.
That's a good looking one. I think that's finished now though, so.
Yeah, but I don't think the prices are too crazy.
Well,
regardless.
wow.
Yeah, it's all relative, but yeah.
But yeah, off the top of my mind, imperfect. If I had a minute to decide, those I would go for.
In the next part, we discuss the economics of watchmaking, going through the costs and profit margins of watch brands. Do subscribe so you don't miss it. Thank you for watching.